Hello everyone and welcome to week 7 of our class. So I apologize that this video is coming a couple days later than I usually like to have it up. I got an email from one of you saying, hey, why is there no video this week? And I was like, of course there's a video, what are you talking about? So I had posted the PowerPoint and posted the script, but had forgot to actually narrate things for you, so I apologize for that. Anyways, so we're in week 7. Uh, I had a very busy week this last week. I know all of you did too, finishing up your papers and everything that's going on in all of your other classes. And I want to let you know that a lot of you, not just in this class but in all my classes, have been reaching out to me just to let me know that you're feeling overwhelmed right now. This is a tough semester. We don't have breaks. I know that for many of you, working remotely is a lot more difficult as well. So one thing that our administration has encouraged us to do is to try and work in lighter work weeks if we can. And what's difficult with that is we still have learning objectives we need to meet for both GE purposes and student learning outcomes for these classes. So uh, working in lighter weeks is a little bit hard, but what I've decided to do for next week and the week after, so for weeks 8 and 9, remember we're in week 7, is I'm only going to require you to complete focus questions on either the Northrop readings or the Gonic readings for those 2 weeks, not both. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a breather. And just remember, this is an asynchronous class, so obviously you can take time off whenever, and hopefully give yourself those rest days. I mean, it's getting to be good weather out, not today, but in a soon. So hopefully you can go on a nice hike and get some nature. Do whatever you need to do. All right, so I uh, I I do want you to know that as I've been looking over your work, I am impressed with what you're doing, and you know we're almost at the halfway point, so you can finish strong and be amazing. Okay, so let's shrink my face and look at some other things. Where can I put my face? Good spot right there. Okay, so our work this week really dovetails nicely with what we covered last week. It builds off of it. We're basically going over what I gave you superficially in more depth. So last week we looked at the context of explorers and native peoples before 1492. This week I want the focus to shift to after 1492, so there will of course be overlap, but this week is really the turning point in our class. This is the week when we'll be talking about an incredibly important global transformation with ramifications that we still feel today. So a good place to start is in this painting that you're looking at right here, showing a treaty signed only 2 years after Columbus's voyage, where Pope Alexander VI essentially divided the undiscovered world arbitrarily between Portugal and Spain. So this Treaty of Tordesillas didn't involve native people, of course, but would have lasting ramifications and colonization patterns in both the Americas and the Pacific, because when they made this treaty, they really didn't even know what was out there yet. So as it turned out, most areas would be claimed by Spain. And where exactly those areas were problematic because they really didn't have an effective way to measure longitude yet. So dividing the world in half when you can't even measure the world is a rather silly thing to do. But the hubris, the assumption that merely seeing somewhere meant that one could claim to own it, that's the lasting legacy that would cause so many changes to the world, and unfortunately inflicts so much lasting harm as well. Okay, so put myself down here under, there we go. So last week I mentioned how unliked the Aztecs were, and how that dislike facilitated their ultimate defeat by a combined force of Spanish conquistadores and disaffected other Mayan people, and also the Tlaxcalans. So your Gonic reading does an amazing job this week, both this week and last, so you have to kind of consider them all together, outlining their arrival in Mesoamerica as well as their defeat and the arrival of the Aztecs and their defeat and co-optation of the previously dominant Toltec peoples. So it can be a little bit hard to follow, but a good comparison just to be able to kind of understand the dynamics in Mesoamerica is to think about what you might know about Greek and Roman civilizations. So the Romans They adored Greek ideas. They based so much of their philosophical, mythical, and religious worldview off of the Greeks. Sometimes even stealing the names of Greek gods and, giving them new Latin names, Roman names. But the Romans also conquered the Greeks in a series of wars, oftentimes with rather disingenuous alliances over more than a century. So, classical histories of the Mediterranean also often emphasize Rome and various Greek city states as if they were the only important players around. But Greek and later Roman history was absolutely shaped and driven by the various people all around them, the so called barbarians. So you have absolutely similar dynamics at play here in Mesoamerica. There are a lot of people there. It's super densely populated even today. But for the Aztecs, they were all peripheral to themselves and the Toltecs, who, the Aztecs thought that the Toltecs were really something else. And the Toltecs, they were the ones who replaced, the amazing civilization at Teotihuacan. And yet, the way the Aztecs replaced the Toltecs was pretty grotesque and disgusting. So in the 1200s, the Aztecs began to ally themselves with the Toltecs in Chuluican, which just as the Romans were allies of the Macedonians before the Macedonian Wars, where they conquered most of Greece. So, as the Aztecs grew more powerful, you had the disgusting example recounted in Gonic, where they murdered, then paraded the skin of the Toltec daughters, of the Toltec king's daughter, as a precursor to their absorption of the entire Toltec Empire. They established a capital in Tenochtitlan that became a regional powerhouse, but it was an incredibly destabilizing power that frequently engaged in war for the sole purpose of taking human captives for sacrifice. These were called flower wars. And as I mentioned last week, the enemies they made in these conflict, like those from the nearby city-state of Tlaxcala, made ready allies of the Spanish, though the Tlaxcalans seemed to engage in their own flower wars for the sake of obtaining sacrificial victims too. So let's jump over here. Yep, trying to switch, come on. Okay. So last week I gave you two readings on the aftermath of the early conquest. One where Juan Sepulveda justified cruel treatment of the natives, and another where a native person himself remembered the plagues that occurred after European contact. I could have given you a reading by the Dominican friar, Bartolome de las Casas, as well, but I think you're all familiar with him from your global studies and American history classes in high school. He's basically one of the good guys. He objected to he was there ostensibly to convert people to Christianity, and yet he saw the horrible treatment that native people received at the hands of the Spanish, and he objected. He even wrote a book about it that actually did help to alleviate Spanish policies towards native peoples. What in and you have that recounted in your Gonic reading for this week. But what inspired De las Casas to write was personally witnessing the absolute dregs of Spanish society, being empowered with muskets to have almost absolute power over others. Those who followed Cortes were often criminals, and they lived within a culture of extreme disregard for human life that was exacerbated by the supposed religious and legal sanction of people like Sepulveda. And that's why it's so important to remember people like De las Casas, who challenged Spanish disregard for human life, supposedly in the service of their God, by referencing that same God and their same scripture to defend human life. So De las Casas was not too different from the earlier Toltec leader, Quetzalcoatl, named for a god common within Mayan and Aztec cosmology, who also argued against the practice of human sacrifice for supposedly religious purposes. So I really want to make this clear. I mean, it's easy to dismiss, the religion of the Mesoamericans as bloodthirsty and horrific because it was, just like it's easy to dismiss the Catholicism of the early conquistadores as bloodthirsty and horrific because it was. But remember, there are people who use these same religious worldviews to argue for moral goodness, for kindness to their fellow human beings. So the Spanish and Aztecs both were led by brutal people, but they had opposition. and a whole ton of people caught in the crosshairs of this craziness. So, just to jump into a few nuts and bolts, when Cortez left Cuba, he was out of favor with the governor there. So, his voyage to nearby Mexico was really a rogue expedition with people who followed him for the sole purpose of plunder. They wanted gold. So, over an incredibly short period of time, once his forces landed in Mexico, he was able to figure out the political divisions of people on the Yucatan Peninsula and exploit them to his favor, while being supported by the power of European immunity to diseases like smallpox. One of the key ways he and later Pizarro did this was with the help of translators. So older Mexican restaurants will sometimes have a picture of Cortez on a horse with a native woman named Malinche. So Cortez and Malinche's child, Martin, is in many traditional accounts the beginning of the mestizo Mexican people, where native and European genes mix to create Mexicans. The painting is intended as a celebration. The power dynamics that would have been involved make it a lot more complicated, though. Malinche seems to have, through her relationship with Cortez, to have been able to explain the complexities of Aztec politics. She helped him gain an audience with the Aztec leader Montezuma. And once one of Cortez's lieutenants decided to attack, she helped to create an alliance with the Tlaxcalans to topple Aztec power in Tenochtitlan. So the Spanish destroyed the city and they built Mexico City on its ruins. Um, Horrifically, in bonfires of rage, they burned thousands of codices of Aztec history and literature, reasoning that such destruction would aid in these people's conversion to Christianity. Only a handful of these books survive, and they were only really deciphered in the 1990s. So only a handful has survived in codex form, and there's a little more that survived as carvings in monumental architecture, but it is tragic to have lost so much of the literature of these amazing people. All right, so let's go back to the Incans, who we briefly talked about last week as well. Again, I think Gonick does an amazing job tying things together so much better than any other introductory textbook that I've used. But it's still a lot to follow. I mean, what you're getting from Gonick is really like a, a semester's worth of South American history. Um, so, of course, it's a lot to follow. So when the Spanish arrived, the Incan Empire was already in the midst of a civil war. They were also at the pinnacle of their power with an incredible road system along the heights of the Andean mountains that allowed them to control what was the longest empire in the world at the time. So from their mountaintops, they were able to collect tribute with and trade with people deep into the plains of places like Peru and Bolivia, what the countries are called today, as well as the vast Amazon rainforest. So for 5 years before the arrival of the Spanish, though, there had been conflict between two half-brothers, Huáscar and Atahualpa, over who could legitimately claim to be emperor of the Inca. So Huáscar had pure-blooded Incan heritage as his claim to power. Atahualpa had control of Quito and a bigger army as his claim to power. So when Pizarro arrived, where are we? Here, I'll be underneath him. Seems disrespectful. Okay. He at first had difficulty even contacting the Inca. They saw that his troops had come down with boils, and they weren't stupid. They knew about communicable diseases. They were in despite the massive rainforests of places like Colombia and Panama today, they still had contact with Central Americans. So they wanted nothing to do with these newcomers. They didn't want to get sick. Eventually, however, Pizarro was able to gain the assistance of a local person, Felipillo, who quickly picked up Spanish. So Felipillo in Peru today is used a lot like Benedict Arnold. It's shorthand for a traitor. So he's this horrible translator who happens to be the only one who can speak both Quechua and Spanish. Um, and he picked up Spanish quickly. So, and it seems he relished being the only one who had this power of communication. And he had personal reasons to want to help the Spanish betray Atahualpa, whose side Pizarro initially took. He was having an affair with one of Atahualpa's concubines. So Felipillo helped the Spanish kidnap Atahualpa, who ransomed him for a roomful of gold, and then killed him anyways. So later, when helping a Spanish army in Chile, he betrayed betrayed the Spanish to the locals, telling them that the Spanish were after their gold, after which he was killed. What really allowed the Spanish to take over this vast empire, however, was the same thing that helped them topple the Aztecs to the north: disease. The Andean Civil War actually ended when Atahualpa's half brother died from smallpox. So, within an incredibly short period of time, the Spanish could lay claim to all of Central and South America, with the exception of the area claimed by Portugal, that would eventually expand into the large colony of Brazil. So, I've hinted. Oops, where are we? Come on. Ay, 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 ay. We want to be at Potosi. All right. I've hinted at the massive global transformations that the conquest of the New World brought about, just about every week this semester. This week and last, we discussed the massive human toll of the first century of contact, namely tens of millions of deaths. The people of the Americas went from having prosperous civilizations to becoming subservient to European colonizers to varying degrees across the hemisphere. Africa, too, would become horribly destabilized and go from being a prosperous, advanced continent to one of horrible exploitation. Outside of the Western Hemisphere, however, one of the biggest transformations to occur in the century after the conquest of the New World is something that's been called the Price Revolution. So the Spanish, they were after gold and silver when they first attacked, and there was a lot of it. For years, their so-called mines were more like smelting stations where the artwork of the New World was melted into coins which were loaded onto ships bound for Europe. Once looting had exhausted the supply of precious metals, they turned to mining. Gonick has an important discussion of Potosi and the world politics surrounding it in this week's reading. So the murderish conditions of Potosi, this high altitude silver mine in modern day Peru, um, uh, the murderous conditions there notwithstanding, its supply of silver is really what changed the world. Kingdoms and empires from Europe, Africa to the Middle East, and importantly Ming Dynasty China, were able to develop sophisticated currencies and transform their economies into ones where the availability of currency was expected. Money wasn't new in the world, of course. It had been around for thousands of years, but the supply of it was so low. The supply of recognizable, precious things that could be exchanged and count for value was low throughout human history, which meant that before Columbus's voyage, barter, especially for ordinary people, remained more common. And in a barter economy, the ability to specialize is only as great as what people are willing to exchange for goods and services. But when you can really make that jump to having currency as an abstract representation of value and labor, suddenly, you can have things like, you know, um, an institution like SUNY Delhi in the middle of the Catskills, where someone like me can get paid to be a history professor, because I know that the money that I get paid can be used to get anything I need. I don't have to, be a part-time professor who then farms, wheat or something so that I can exchange it for things of value that I need. So it's an enormous transformation. Uh, and with this specialization, the world changes. So the other transformation happening is that the premier type of organization in much of the world, serfdom. Many more advanced economies are moving away from that. Rich people don't want to just control people's labor producing basic crops anymore. They want to specialize, and specializing into trades is possible after this currency revolution. And again, I don't want to oversimplify this. Certainly, trades and specializations existed before. There's just more of it now that you have more of a supply of money. So later, this oversupply of silver from Potosi would cause inflation across the world, leading many great empires like the Ming of China, the Spanish Empire itself, the Ming to fall, the Spanish to become incredibly weak, as they simply did not understand how macroeconomics worked. Gold and silver on their own don't actually have value. They represent labor, resources, and production. So getting more gold and silver doesn't improve your economy unless it's being translated into more labor, more things of use. So let's jump ahead now. So shortly after the Treaty of Tordesillas, uh, the Portuguese began working to get to the wealth of India from the other direction. So in 1497, Vasco da Gama, built on decades of Portuguese experience plying the coasts of West Africa, you've read about this already in your Northrop book, to go even further. So he journeyed deep into the South Atlantic Ocean, then went west around the tip of South Africa, then up the coast of East Africa, stopping along the fabulously wealthy coastal cities of East Africa. The first time Europeans had come here by ship, before cutting across the Indian Ocean to the kingdom of Calicut in the south of India. The trade item that he was most after was black pepper. The kind that's so common today that restaurants give it out to you for free, right next to the salt shaker and ketchup bottle. When he offered the people of Calicut the kinds of trinkets that the Spanish tried to pass off as trade items in the New World, the sophisticated people of Calicut in India essentially laughed at him. They wanted gold. They agreed with the Europeans on what was of value. So Da Gama returned to Portugal somewhat empty-handed, but then came back a few years later. And when he returned, his ships took a group of pilgrims returning from Mecca hostage. This is off the coast of Calicut, demanding tribute from them in an episode not unlike what Pizarro had done to Atahualpa. So even after they paid, he set their ship on fire and sunk it, murdering all of the people on board. He then bombarded Calicut, setting a precedent that would absolutely transform the Indian Ocean. Over the next decades, the Portuguese militarized what had been a mostly peaceful trade zone for almost a millennium. They also redirected trade with India and China from the Middle East to the ocean, bankrupting kingdoms like the Mamelukes of Egypt. Their chief competition would come from the Ottoman Empire, who were able to push the Portuguese out of the Arabian Peninsula and exploit the weakness of Egypt to incorporate it into their empire. Remember, this is the same period that the Ethiopians were trying to establish better contact with the Catholic powers of Europe, and the same period when the Mali Empire was falling victim to the Songhai in West Africa. So there were serious reverberations of these voyages of discovery and conquest. So we'll have more readings on the Ottomans later in the semester, but I want to introduce them now. They were an empire with a lot of incongruencies. They they identified as Islamic, though for most of their history, most of their people were Christians. They were considered a Middle Eastern power, though for most of their history, most of their population was in what we today consider Europe. They emerged in the aftermath of Genghis Khan's collapse, but lasted until the end of World War I. They were a sophisticated empire with incredible innovations in statecraft, technology, and culture, though they were often seen as barbarians by their neighbors. So, lots of anomalies. They originated as a spin-off from the Turkic groups that were in power across the Middle East in the aftermath of the Crusades and Mongol invasions, the Seljuks. The name of the empire refers to the dynasty of their first ruler, Osmania, as Ottoman. So in the 1300s, they conquered much of the Balkan Peninsula in Europe while maintaining power on the Anatolian Peninsula, modern-day Turkey. But they had this big lacuna in their empire right in the middle, the city of Constantinople, which was not theirs. So shortly after conquering places, though, they invested in infrastructure, which is one reason why they weren't resisted much after establishing their power. This picture is of a bridge in Skopje, Macedonia, or North Macedonia, as the country's called today. It was built in the 1300s by the Ottomans. Skopje, Macedonia is a very modern looking city. I mean, you can see these, this is a shopping center in the background here. Um, but the whole city looks super, nouveau and modern because the city was almost entirely leveled by an earthquake in 1963. This bridge was one of the few structures still standing after the earthquake. It was so well built. Um, so the Ottomans, just a fun testament to, how cool the Ottomans could be. The Ottomans, they were also a gunpowder empire, as I mentioned last week. In 1453, then, they conquered Constantinople, taking control of these lucrative trade routes right before they got circumvented by the Portuguese. Yet the Ottomans would persist for centuries, always trying to innovate, even as the economies along the edges of the Atlantic Ocean completely supplanted them. Okay, so we've dealt with a lot of material over these 7 weeks so far. You hopefully also have a nice picture of what the world was like as it's transitioning. So here's a nice softball, easy bonus question that you're welcome to answer any way you'd like. You have to give me a reason for why you picked the place you picked, though. So as always, enjoy yourselves. Have a good week, and I will be getting your papers back to you very soon. Hopefully, most of you will have your papers back today, but I don't want to sound like the IRS promising and then not giving stimulus checks in a timely manner. I will get you your papers. If not today, then tomorrow. All right. Have a good day. Have a good week. Bye.